been quite a year for Timo Werner.
Look at Timo Werner. Horner's going to elect to stay and try and block him now. Timo Werner was never going to miss. It's 3-1 Leipzig.
And Werner scores. Ice cool finish from the spot. From the main man for RB Leipzig. And Tottenham fall behind. It's Tottenham 0, Leipzig 1.
Second highest scorer in the Bundesliga. He's now wanted by a host of Premier League clubs.
A lot of speculation about the future of Timo Werner. This is what he had to say. If a move were to become an issue at some point, I would be more tempted by a move abroad than a move to Bayern.
But after a deal with Bayern Munich fell through last year, everyone was expecting the young German striker to end up in Liverpool.
Timo Werner is a great player. Kai Havertz is a great player. Right time, opportunity, everything has to come together. At the moment, all clubs are losing money.
Last week, though, it became apparent that the Merseyside club couldn't afford him, opening the door for Chelsea to make an approach.
If your owner comes to you and says, "Oh no, sorry, we can't do this. We're going to win the Premier League. We won the Champions League last year, but we spent money on Alisson or whatever. We can't go and do this." Would you be accepting that?
In this episode, we ask, why can Chelsea buy Timo Werner and Liverpool can't?
The rumblings came in the few days before the deal was finalised.
Simon Johnson covers Chelsea for The Athletic.
Everyone was pretty much sure that he was going to Liverpool, myself included. So things developed very, very quickly, which is why the transfer made such big headlines.
So it came as a fairly big surprise to you then?
Yes, mainly because he wanted to go to Liverpool. That was his first choice. Basically, if Liverpool could agree a deal with RB Leipzig, he was going to Liverpool. It didn't matter who else was going to come in for him, whether they agreed the clause, etc., etc. He wanted to go to Liverpool. So when Liverpool dropped out, it was like an open goal for Chelsea to come in and basically take him from Anfield to Stamford Bridge.
So you've mentioned already that Liverpool was sort of the promised destination for Werner. Could you talk us through how the transfer saga unfolded then? How was it that Liverpool ended up dropping him?
I'll just quickly go back to last summer because that's when Liverpool made their first move for Timo Werner. Certainly discussions were had with him. This was at a point when Timo Werner certainly looked like he was going to go to Bayern Munich, but Liverpool were in the race too. He was very nervous though about joining Liverpool, so I'm led to believe at that stage because of fears over getting into the team with Salah, Mane and Firmino. Why this has a knock-on effect is he was sure he was joining Bayern Munich, and then they dropped out, and that has had a knock-on effect in terms of how Timo Werner was thinking mentally. Liverpool reached out for him again. Jurgen Klopp, he's very good at this. He's done this before. He talks extensively to the players he's after. He wins them over, and he was definitely telling Werner about his plans. The plan was that he would be introduced slowly into the squad. There wouldn't be too much pressure on him because of the presence of those three players. But of course, the Africa Cup of Nations was on the horizon, so losing Mane and Salah was in Klopp's mind, so he would have been increasingly playing a part at Liverpool. But as it turned out, Liverpool basically just don't have the funds. Fenway Sports Group made it pretty clear to Jurgen Klopp that they weren't in a position to meet the release clause. RB Leipzig was certainly not going to reduce the price, and that's when Klopp reached out to Werner and told him personally that the deal wasn't going to happen. They parted on good terms, and that just left the door open for Chelsea to come in and do a deal with RB Leipzig.
So after Liverpool concluded their negotiations, what's the timeline from that point onwards?
Chelsea had been keen on him for months. I'm led to believe he was Frank Lampard's number one target to improve the front line from a very early stage in the season, but they were aware that they faced incredible competition, obviously mostly from Liverpool, so they had started to consider other options. That's where you sort of see the names of Pierre-Emerick Aubameyang, who was definitely on the B list, as it were, for want of a better phrase. Dries Mertens was someone that they were keen on too, but there's no doubt about it, Werner was the one they wanted. Once they got wind of Liverpool dropping out, the club itself went into operation in terms of doing the deal on the financial side. Meanwhile, Frank Lampard, just like Jurgen Klopp, was on the phone to Timo Werner, selling him Chelsea Football Club and easing some of his concerns, because everyone knows Chelsea is a club that chops and changes their manager more than most. He had his concerns about Lampard's security there. Lampard assured him that not only has he been promised another season, but there is a long-term plan involved, and basically sold him the dream, the long-term plan that Chelsea have, which isn't just about spending this summer, it's spending next summer and the summer after that. And so Werner, who may have had some reservations, my colleague David Ornstein talks about he was thinking about staying another season at RB Leipzig. But RB Leipzig needed the money. They've got worries about financial fair play. They wanted this deal done. And basically it came together where Werner said yes to Lampard, RB Leipzig have said yes to Chelsea. And it's just a matter of time now when it all gets finalised.
You've covered Chelsea for a while. How different does this transfer saga feel to the other ones that you've covered in your time?
This reminds me of the summer 2014 to a degree. The same with Ziyech. These two buys are like when Chelsea just went out and did it quickly with Diego Costa and Cesc Fabregas in that summer. They didn't mess about. They beat the competition. The same with N'Golo Kante in 2016. There have been other sagas that have dragged on and on and on, and they've lost out on players. So this feels like Chelsea getting back to what they do best, or what they've done best in the past. One classic example from the summer of 2017 of Lukaku dragged on and on and on, and they eventually lost out to him and ended up having to pick up Morata as a bit of a consolation prize. Chelsea's transfer business in recent years has been squad strengthening rather than first team strengthening. This is very much an area where they're looking to change. They want first team players. The squad players have been useful to a degree, but if Chelsea have got a hope of bridging the gap to Liverpool and Man City, which is what Frank Lampard's been very public about, then they needed to bring in big name first team players, and that's exactly what they've started to do.
How much of a coup for Chelsea is this signing, being able to jump in front of Liverpool and pick up a player that Liverpool really want, but they just aren't able to do?
It's a massive coup for a few reasons. It sends out a signal of intent. We were told that Liverpool's own scouting department rated Timo Werner above the likes of Havertz and Jadon Sancho. Yeah, that's quite a compliment right there in itself. It is a sign of the times that they can't spend, but they clearly wanted him as part of this squad. And if the champions want a player and they can't get him, then whoever does succeed in getting him, that's got to be some player, right? He's second in the goal-scoring charts behind Robert Lewandowski in the Bundesliga. Chelsea have lacked goals. It's been one of their weaknesses under Lampard so far. They create lots of chances, but that killer instinct is what's been lacking, and that's what Timo Werner looks like he can bring in abundance. So I really think this has got everyone in the game talking, certainly in England, and for good reason, because it looks like Chelsea are turning from a team fighting for Champions League qualification to a side that could potentially challenge at the top of the table again.
And do you think that this is suggestive that Chelsea are going to go big in the transfer window this time around?
Yeah, I mean, there's more to come from what I understand. Ben Chilwell, the left-back, is definitely the next name that they really want. Havertz, they've started negotiations with too. I was told before this business started that Lampard had received the reassurances that he would be backed heavily in the transfer market despite the pandemic. Chelsea see this as an opportunity. their rivals are struggling to make big deals in the market, that they're in a position where they can. So it can really make them bridge the gap where they lost out a year ago when they couldn't go out and spend. And they also lost Eden Hazard, don't forget. So I do think this is really significant. Chelsea will carry on spending, but I would also add a note of caution that Chelsea will have to let some players go, and there's quite a few players that, even some of the first team players that could be part of this exodus.
Russian billionaire owner Roman Abramovich, the big man who came to Chelsea in 2003, bought up the South West London club because Chelsea were in the Champions League for the following season, and of course the rest is history.
I'm interested in how this fits into the wider history of Roman Abramovich's dealings with the club, because it feels as though it was only the beginning of this season where there was huge questions about how involved Abramovich wanted to be, particularly with the visa issues that were rumbling on. How does this fit in the wider history of Abramovich's dealings?
Well, I think the real indication of Abramovich's commitment, because you're right, there's been a lot of scrutiny, a lot of stories. I've heard mixed things over the last couple of years. Some people saying he's definitely willing to sell it, others saying no, he's as committed as ever. But of course, the fact he's not been at Stamford Bridge has led to people wondering, has this guy fell out of love with the game? Well, I think the last financial accounts gave a pretty emphatic answer when it emerged that he'd ploughed in another 247 million into the club, which is a remarkable figure. All the impression is, as I said about his backing for Lampard in the market, is that he wants to see Chelsea back to what they were. So in the grand scheme of things, are we going to see Abramovich celebrating at Stamford Bridge in his box again like we have for many years? I don't know the answer to that question, to be honest with you. He's a very private person. No one knows what Roman's going to do until he does it. But it does seem to me that as far as making Chelsea successful are concerned, he's as willing as he ever was.
You've already mentioned that Chelsea are viewing this period as an opportunity to really get ahead in the market from a financial point of view. How successful do you expect them to be? Do you think that this is going to be a strong period going forward for Chelsea Football Club?
Well, they have some gap to bridge. Liverpool have been remarkable, and Man City, of course, in recent years have been remarkable. So it is a huge, huge gulf to bridge, but you would have to say they are the next best placed team to do that. They are a remarkable club in many respects, in that they are almost the business model of how not to operate as a football club, and yet they've won more trophies than anyone else since Abramovich took over in 2003. I think it's baby steps. I don't expect them to win the title next season, but I certainly see them being in the race, which is more than they have been in the last couple of years where they've been well off the pace.
Are you a fan of football today? Why not support the show and sign up to our new Patreon page? You'll get access to bonus episodes, full and unedited interviews, and lots more extra content. To join us, just visit patreon.com and search for Football Today. Now back to today's episode. This sea change in the world of football finance, which sees the Champions League holders and imminent Premier League winners unable to spend €60 million on an elite striker, suggests that we're going to see a changing of the guard at the highest level of football. I spoke to Kieran Maguire, a football finance expert at Liverpool University and co-host of the Price of Football podcast, to find out more. We began by talking about the state of the market before coronavirus hit.
I think the days of the 100 million plus transfer were beginning to taper off, simply because those marquee signings, with one or two exceptions, had proven to be failures. You would normally anticipate spending that degree of money, that you're going to get guaranteed success on the back of it. But if you look at Dembele, Coutinho, Pogba was not far off that. Many of these transfers have been a bit of a disappointment. It's difficult to work out the position in France because, with due respect, Neymar and Mbappe were moving into a side that was guaranteed to win the French league anyway, and it hasn't transferred into success in Europe. On the back of that, I think buying clubs were becoming slightly more reticent about the very high fees, but the mid-tier market was very solid. That sort of 40 to 70 million pound bracket for the clubs who are regularly in the last round of 16, last state of the Champions League. Those transfers were becoming the norm, and people weren't blinking at a 40 or 50 million signing. Again, if you go down a further tier, there was plenty of activity in the market. Once you drop out of the Premier League, what we have seen in the Championship and below, clubs really were only spending money now if they'd previously managed to sell a player, because the impact of financial fair play was beginning to bite in terms of budgets.
Even before coronavirus, we were being told that we were heading towards some kind of recession. Was there any sense in football that we were heading towards a market downturn?
No, I think in football it would have been more of a plateau. The last TV deal, which was for this season for the next 3 years domestically, had fallen in value by 10%. The nature of football is that its spending is very much determined by revenues. So when revenues start to decline a wee bit, then you see spending following. The Premier League was fortunate that overseas TV deals were still very lucrative, so they compensated for the decline in domestic revenues. But as far as commercial deals are concerned, there was not a lot of growth. Whoever signed off on the Manchester United and Chevrolet deal, I believe that person was sacked within a month when Chevrolet's senior executives found out the extent to which they were committed. If we take a look at the Nike deal with Liverpool, that's actually on a much lower guaranteed sum for the club than their previous deal with New Balance, although by all accounts the commission they get for each piece of merchandise that's sold is very good by footballing standards. So football is fairly resilient to recessions historically because of the addictive nature of the product. I think people would still be going. They might be cutting back on spending once they got to grounds. And I think that certainly will be the case going forwards.
Was there any sense that clubs were responding to this uncertainty in their outputs?
I think they were looking to find alternatives to try to generate new relationships to increase their income streams. But football clubs are actually quite conservative organisations traditionally, and therefore I think there were a few lost opportunities. Going forwards, they're going to have to be innovative, because I know things have improved in some other countries, and I think in New Zealand they've just had their first mass gatherings taking place for rugby. So that is something to look forwards to, but we seem to be so far behind other countries here in the UK, and that's not a political comment, that's sort of a statistical observation, that trying to compensate for the lack of matchday revenue and also the potential negative impact that COVID-19 is going to have on sponsorship and negotiations of that nature should force clubs to innovate, but traditionally they've got such a short-term approach that they'll be reluctant to do so.
So what's your take on the Timo Werner transfer saga? Why is it that Chelsea can buy Werner and Liverpool can't?
Because the chain of command in Chelsea is actually quite short. Frank Lampard puts a phone call through to his boss, says, I want to sign Timo Werner. Roman Abramovich says yes, deal done. Whereas with Liverpool, their business model is intriguing. If you take a look at Liverpool's accounts over the course of the last 4 or 5 years, their football costs have been very much determined by revenue, and they've aimed to break even. Now, in a post-COVID environment, if we work on the basis, best case scenario for next season is that they get half of their traditional matchday income. And I think that's overly ambitious on my part. You're talking about 40 to 50 million pounds less in revenues coming in. FSG operate a fairly tight financial ship. I don't know whether you've seen what's been happening with their baseball team, but everybody who's earning over $50,000 a year has been forced to take a pay cut. So I think it would be difficult for FSG to justify spending 50 to 60 million pounds on a player of the nature of Timo Werner. At the same time, they're telling their staff back in Boston, which ultimately is their home base, you've got to take pay cuts. I think from a public relations point of view, from a motivational point of view, it would have been an absolute disaster.
Can we talk a little bit about the way that Chelsea's transfer ban has impacted them in the market? Because I think this comes into play here.
The transfer ban, in many respects, gave them a breathing space and allowed them to have relatively little pressure on Frank Lampard in the sense that he was expected just to be able to blood new players coming through. So we've had Abraham, Tomori, Mount and others. That's actually saved them a fortune, which again has actually given them an advantage going into the current market, in the sense that if you take a look at the way most transfers are negotiated these days, they're all being done on credit terms. So therefore, because Chelsea didn't spend money the previous year, they had the advantage of not having to be paying out money this summer on outstanding instalments for transfers from last summer's window.
Do Brexit concerns come into this at all? Are we going to see clubs bringing in foreign talent now just to avoid any potential visa problems after Britain officially leaves the EU?
I think that will be certainly a consideration. What we are probably more likely to see is closer relationships between Premier League clubs and clubs in the European Union. If you look at Manchester City, they own 44% of Girona. They've just bought a club, I think, in the Belgian second division. What they can therefore do is to use these clubs as talent identifiers, recruit them for those clubs, and then when they have sufficient points under the new proposed schemes, they might be able to be transferred to the mothership. I think Brighton have got similar. Tony Bloom, the Brighton owner, he's bought a Belgian second division club. This could be a way around the complications caused by Brexit for clubs. At the same time, Brexit is an opportunity for the domestic academies to start to bear fruit, because clearly the pathway to first team playing, to a certain extent, will be cleared for the lower league clubs, that's for certain, and also I think for the bottom half of the Premier League.
Next season now, there's no African Nations Cup, there's no Olympics. And I think that's one of the big reasons why Liverpool didn't really push the boat out to get Timo Werner. I think it could do them the world of good, really do.
You can't afford him.
We don't need to afford them. World champions, European champions, Premier League champions in about 2 weeks.
Let's move on to talk about Liverpool a little bit, because I think we're at an interesting stage where if winning the Premier League and the Champions League put you behind clubs like Chelsea, who've obviously dropped away in terms of on-field performances in recent years, what does this say about football as a financial market right now, and how is that going to impact it in terms of external buyers coming in and looking at football clubs as potential assets?
It's very difficult to compete against multi-billionaires when you're only a billionaire. That sounds glib, but Roman Abramovich can afford to put 250 million into Chelsea in a year. The Liverpool owners are not in that position. You know, John Henry is wealthy, but he is looking over a series of sports franchises, and that's how Liverpool are viewed by FSG. It is a sports franchise. They're looking to generate a financial return on that investment, whereas Abramovich's and Mansour's is mainly a sporting return on the investment. Therefore, Liverpool, I think, have to be a little bit smarter, and that has been evidenced by the fact that they are taking a data-driven approach to player recruitment. If you take a look at the clubs with the three biggest data divisions in the Premier League, it's Liverpool, Manchester City and Leicester, and of course those three clubs are occupying Champions League places at present, whereas some of the more old-school forms of recruitment, I think, are playing catch-up. So Liverpool are having to make sure that that data division does get good return. They've not spent huge sums, certainly on a net basis, in the transfer market, although they have been very fortunate, I think, to have sold Philippe Coutinho for the sum that they received for him. But if you think about also the sales of Suarez and Sterling, they've generated an awful lot of money from player sales. I think they might have a slight disappointment in the sense that because they've been able to use the Liverpool brand name when selling players who weren't necessarily household names. They sold a goalkeeper. I think it was Danny Ward, went for around about 12 million for a player who played twice. That's where the Liverpool brand is a useful way of inflating prices in the market, but that's not going to be the place post-COVID, because the likes of Leicester simply won't be spending money here. They'll be battening down the hatches unless they get into the Champions League, like all of the non-Big Six clubs.
Yeah, it's interesting you talking about these outfits that are looking to garner profit in some way in the market. You've obviously talked about Liverpool, but I think another example of that is AC Milan and the Elliott Management Corporation, where they buy a club because the guy who owned it defaulted on his debts to them, and they've got into this situation now where they're trying to garner as much profit as they can, either in selling it or just through the club running itself. These sorts of clubs are clearly going to lose out to state-sponsored or oligarch-owned ventures. So do you think that we're going to see fewer of these sorts of attempts to run football clubs for maximal profits?
My understanding is that at present there are a lot of private equity organisations who are looking at football clubs, mainly because they see them as bargain purchases. There's lots of present owners who are selling them as distressed assets. The nature of private equity is that it will introduce more financial rigour into those clubs, and on the back of that try to make them leaner organisations. And that can be a challenge for a football club, which is very much, its success is based on talent. And therefore, it's a bit counterintuitive. If you're trying to cut back costs, that could mean that you end up cutting back on football recruitment costs, which is, of course, the main driver of success on the field, qualifying for Champions League and so on. I think these private equity organisations, they will be the ones who will be pressing most of all for the reorganisation of the Champions League into more of a closed shop with guaranteed income streams and things of this nature. These people are not friends of football, in my opinion.
We keep being told that the world will never be the same again after coronavirus. How do you think this is going to look in terms of the transfer market in football?
I anticipate that the transfer market will be split into a series of tiers. You will have the elite, who will continue to be able to act as if they are the elite. But even within that, there'll be a couple of subgroups. You'll have clubs where the ownership model is that of a trophy asset. So therefore, we're looking at the likes of PSG, Chelsea, Manchester City. They'll be able to spend as much money as they want as before. Roman Abramovich was able to spend 150 million on Munch's The Scream last week on a whim. He's in a position to exploit the market, as we've seen, I think, in respect of Timo Werner. The other clubs in the elite will still be able to spend significant sums of money, but there will be a degree of caution. I think we've seen that so far with Liverpool. Manchester United is an unknown. A lot will depend, as far as the transfer market is concerned, of course, as to final league positions and the impact upon Champions League places, because the Champions League is becoming increasingly a very lucrative form of revenue for clubs. Not only does it impact upon revenues, but it also impacts upon penalty clauses from sponsors. Outside of the elite, if you drop then to the mid-tier clubs, it's a completely different market because they were already losing money. Over half of the clubs in the Premier League are losing money on a day-to-day basis. They've got less coming in. They're looking to cut back. They can't cut back on wages because they're committed to long-term contracts. So therefore they look at discretionary spending. And the first thing you'd look at from a football club's perspective is transfer spend.
You can read all of Simon Johnson's coverage of Chelsea over at The Athletic. Kieran Maguire is a football finance expert working at Liverpool University and co-host of the Price of Football podcast. This episode was produced by Josh Schneiderweiler. I'm John Mackenzie. Thanks for listening to Football Today. If you enjoy this podcast, why not subscribe to our Patreon and get a raft of bonus material? Or, if you can't spare the cash, why not help us out by sharing an episode with a friend? See you next time.